the Black Death, 1347 to 1350. The Great Mortality, as it was described at that time. And it's rare that you hear somebody say, well, you know, the Reformation sort of required that plague. A lot of people describe the Reformation as a plague, but it was in the background because so many people died. When I was in seminary, the number we were given was 1 out of every 3 people. I read a couple of books before going to Germany, and the modern books in some areas will be as high as 70%. So many of those would say, on average to the whole population, 50%, 1 out of every 2 people. Talk about thinking that the world's about to end. Many people believed exactly that. The world was about to end. You couldn't blame them for thinking it. And some forms of the plague, you know, we believe it was the bubonic plague, but there was a lung-based version of it. The regular plague would give you, well, it was about, there would be a very small number of people that would survive it, maybe 10 to 15%. The form where it started in your lungs, there was no recording of anyone that survived it, and generally, from the time it first manifested till your death was about 18 hours. 18 hours. That's why some people at that time actually developed the theory that you could contract it merely by looking in the eyes of an infected person. Because, you know, if it can kill in 18 hours, you can understand why people would come up with that idea. And by the way, horrible, horrible aspect of the Black Death at that time. See, despite Al Gore and all the radical leftist socialists of our day who are trying to convince us that your SUV is killing the planet, the temperatures in the world have changed down through the centuries. And historians have known for a very, very long time that there have been these warming intervals and then cooling intervals. And a warming interval has started around the beginning of the 12th century, and it lasted most of that century, which had allowed for the utilization of land much farther north to be put into cultivation than had been available for centuries. We know this to be true for many reasons, but there are, for example, towns in England that are named after vineyards that you can't grow grapes in today. We know that when they were founded, you could. You can't anymore, which means it's cooler today than it was then. So much for your SUV. But that warming trend began to break down, and a distinct cooling trend began. Had nothing to do with nuclear weapons. Again, mankind, nothing to do with any of this. But started at the beginning of the 14th century. And there had been a real population increase. If you can grow more food, people have more babies, and you have more people. And there had been a real population increase. Now all of a sudden, a lot of people are right on the edge. And when you have populations living right on the edge, these are populations that are very subject to plague and to disease and things like that. The theory is that the cold in the Russian steppes drove these, not rats, but the original carriers of the bubonic plague farther south into the trade routes, and hence brought the fleas first into Muslim areas, and many people were in Muslim lands were impacted by the plague. And then in late 1347 into Sicily, and then up into all of Europe, England, et cetera, et cetera. And people did everything to try to avoid the plague. They didn't understand what we understand today. Every scientific treatise that I'm familiar with, whether it was written by Muslims or Christians, that dealt with the plague, included astrological information. Because people on both sides of that theological divide recognized that there had been a rather important conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, I believe in 1345, which was supposed to portend great changes in the world. And I'm pretty certain there's a papal document pointing to that same conjunction in 1345 as having something to do with the rise of the plague in 1347. There was a lot of astrology in that time period. But what's fascinating to me is, as far as I know, the Muslims never blamed the Jews for the plague, but the Christians did. And I forget which Swiss town it was. It might have been Zurich, somewhere near a lake, so it's probable. It might have been Geneva. I don't know. I've forgotten. I could look it up. But the story began to be circulated that the Jews were poisoning wells, and that the poisoning of the wells where the plague came from. Well, that was stupid, because the plague was ravaging cities that were completely dependent upon rivers that didn't even use wells. So it didn't even make any sense. But under torture, Jews would confess. You know, it's really easy to get people to confess to things when you're torturing them. And so this one city actually took all their Jews and put them out on an island in a building and burned it down. Killed them. And it's fascinating to me, sad to me, that at this point in time, the Muslims didn't come up with that idea, but the Christians did, quote unquote Christians did. But what does all that have to do with Reformation? Well, simple. Let's take the figures I was given of 1 out of every 3. It was probably higher than that, but let's just take that as a low number. What happens if 1 out of every 3 people in a society disappears? Well, economically, the guy down at the bottom who is just a laborer, all of a sudden his labor is worth a whole lot more, because good luck finding somebody to work your land. You got to have somebody do it. So all of a sudden, he can make a whole lot more. And the people can afford to do so. Why? Because if 1 out of 3 people disappear, all of a sudden, you got all this money, and back then it wasn't a credit economy. So you've got all this money, you got all this gold, property, and there's only 2/3 as many people to possess it now, which means pretty much everybody gets a big fat raise. And so the plague was one of the many things that led to the rise of the middle class, and broke down the feudalism of the preceding centuries, which had been so destructive. You had universities beginning to be founded, 12th century, but to have many universities and to have enough students to actually really substantiate them, you need to have a middle class. And the plague was very important in producing a middle class. Most people never think of it along those lines. also provide us with a nursery rhyme that no one will ever use again after you realize this is about. But ring around the rosy, pocket full of posy, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. We all held hands and danced around in circles, celebrating the Black Death. Yes, that's where it came from. Black Death. That's where it was all about. Was they would dance around these poles. They would carry pockets full of posy, ashes, ashes. We all fall down. We all die. Some of our childhood things are extremely dark when you actually look back at what gave rise to them. But it was it was pretty amazing. So anyway, very important in bringing these things about and as part of the background to the rise of the Reformation. I was talking a little bit about the fact that there had been a warming period that had resulted in a great increase in human population, and that we know this had happened because we can find cities in England named after vineyards and things. We know there had been vineyards there. You can't grow grapes there. It's too cold now. But at an earlier period of time when it was founded, you could. And so we know there was a period of time leading up to around 1300 where you had warmer temperatures. Even in places in Greenland and Iceland, there were places where you could cultivate crops for a period of time, which you cannot any longer today. So it was warmer back then. Then that started changing, and you went into a colder period, beginning at the start of the 14th century. The theory is that the natural hosts of the rodent-type animals in the Russian steppes, the natural hosts, were driven by the cold down into the trade routes from China. And through those fleas, this is how the disease vector made it into Islamic lands, and then from Islamic lands into Christian lands, starting in Sicily, late 1347, and then really hitting in 1348 across all of Europe. Now, a couple of things. Some people feel that the plague did not hit Islamic lands as hard as they did Christian lands. And the reason's simple. Muslims in that time period had a much higher hygiene level than people in Christian Europe did. I'm using the term Christian Europe as a historian here, not theologically speaking. Sadly, I mean, obviously, it's called wadu. It's the cleansing, the ritual cleansing before the prayers. There is bathing as a part of normal Islamic hygiene. Did you know that, for example, I think it was Catherine of Siena, one of the great mystic women of this time period, that one of her great claims to fame and spirituality was she never bathed. Never. And an average person would go for a year without changing their clothes in Europe. I just sort of figure your olfactory nerves just burned out by the time you were 3. So after that, it was like, yeah, whatever. It makes me go, ugh. But you need to remember our modern level of hygiene and deodorant and showering, real modern thing. So the Muslims had the advantage because they were cleaner, just physically cleaner at that point in time. But one other negative thing is that the story began to develop in Europe that the Jews were behind the plague, that they were poisoning wells. Well, it was absurd. The plague began in places where wells weren't in use. You were dependent upon rivers and things like that. So poisoning wells would be irrelevant. But under torture, certain Jews admitted to this. And so Jews were driven out of town. They were killed. One city in Switzerland took all of their Jews, put them out on an island in a building and burned them. So many Christians blamed Jews. What's interesting is the Muslims never did. As far as I know, I could be wrong. If you want to prove me wrong, prove me wrong. But as far as I know, at this time period, the Muslims did not come up with the idea of blaming Jews for the plague. I can think of a lot of Muslims today that would, but they didn't back then. So something to keep in mind. Well, what happens as a result of the plague? Let's go with the numbers I was taught, which are conservative numbers, that 1 out of every 3 people disappear. What is the result of that on a culture? Well, if you're just a manual worker working a farm, working out in the fields, all of a sudden your labor is worth a lot more because they've got less competition. Less competition, prices go up. But at the same time, if you have a fixed amount of stuff, this isn't a credit society as yet. So if you have a fixed amount of gold and a fixed amount of land, and all of a sudden 1/3 of everybody disappears, you now still have the same amount of stuff, but you only got 2/3 the number of people, which means everybody gets a big raise. And what the Black Plague actually helped to do was to give impetus to the rise of the middle class. And that middle class was vitally important because universities, which had been founded earlier than this, to have lots of universities and to have universities flourishing, you got to have students. And the middle class has always been, there's only a certain number of upper class hooty-tooty people. The middle class has always been, where you'd get your students. And so the Black Plague was very important in the rise of the conditions that allowed for the Reformation to take place and to destroy the medieval serfdom situation that we had at that particular point in time.